An ordinary trip to the grocery store turned into a memorable confrontation when an elderly woman told Shaquille O'Neal he should go back to Africa, where he supposedly belongs. What he says next isn't just a big surprise, it's a moment that changes everything. Don't miss this. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you are watching from. The grocery store was buzzing with the sounds of people doing their daily shopping. People were pushing their carts up and down the aisle, some deep in thought, others talking in hushed tones. It was a bright afternoon in Newark, New Jersey, where Shaquille O'Neal had grown up. But today, the regular routine would be interrupted in a surprising way. Over by the fruits and vegetables, an elderly lady named Mrs. Nelia, who looked to be in her late 60s, was adjusting her glasses. She seemed a bit impatient, grumbling as she grabbed a bag of apples. With her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair, she looked like someone you wouldn't notice. But what happened next was anything but normal. Shaquille O'Neal, wearing his usual relaxed look with a blue Compton hoodie and jeans, walked up to the same fruit stand to pick up some oranges. He was calm, polite, and seemed to fit right in. Shaq was texting on his phone while holding his shopping basket when the incident occurred. Mrs. Nelia turned sharply, noticing Shaq, and her face changed. It wasn't subtle. Her eyes narrowed and her lips tightened. "You people don't belong here," she said loudly, with a tone that made sure everyone nearby could hear. Shaq stopped. His fingers paused over his phone. When he looked up, she continued, her voice sharp and harsh. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from? This isn't your place and you'll never be welcome here. If I had bananas, I would have given you one." The atmosphere grew tense. Some shoppers nearby stopped. Some shared uncomfortable looks, while others acted like they hadn't heard anything. The store's usual rhythm stopped, replaced by an awkward silence that felt endless. Shaq was shocked at first. His eyebrows came together, and for a second, it seemed like he might respond right away, but he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, his expression unreadable as he seemed to consider his next words. Mrs. Nelia, still holding her apples, didn't back down. She was firm and unapologetic. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone around could feel it. A young mom named Diane quickly moved her child away, while an older man in his early 70s, Mr. Arthur by the potatoes, watched Shaq with a nervous look, waiting for his reaction. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could be, setting the scene for what would come next. For a moment, Shaq stood still, his hand tight on his basket handle. It felt like the world around him narrowed down, with every sound muted and every eye on him. The weight of Mrs. Nelia's words hung in the air like a bad smell that nobody could escape. Mrs. Nelia didn't back down. She stood firm, like she was ready for a fight. She huffed and adjusted her cardigan, her chin up like she was daring him to say something back. A young worker named Marcus, who was stacking bananas nearby, stopped what he was doing, unsure if he should get involved or not. Loretta the cashier stretched her neck to see better. The crowd around them didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. They were all witnesses now, whether they liked it or not. Shaq looked at Mrs. Nelia, his face calm, but his eyes were thinking hard. He had a million things he could say, like yelling or walking away, but none of that felt right. The tension was heavy on him, but he took a moment to breathe. He switched his basket to his other hand and stood up straighter, his presence growing in the quiet. When he spoke, his voice was calm but clear, cutting through the awkwardness. "Ma'am," he started, his tone even. "Do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't to accuse but to make her think, though she didn't seem to want to reflect. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice getting louder. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Someone near the bread, surely, gasped, and the crowd's whispers got louder. But Shaq stayed steady. He didn't shout or move closer. He let the silence stretch, letting her words sink in for everyone. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. His calm was almost eerie, making everyone pay attention. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Shaq set his basket down carefully on the floor. His calmness felt like a magnet, pulling everyone closer, even those trying to pretend they weren't listening. He looked at Mrs. Nelia not with anger, but with a quiet, determined look that made her shift in her spot. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady but strong. "But let me tell you about where I come from. My great-great-grandfather was born here in New Jersey, but before that they were brought here against their will, working like animals to build this very state, this country you're standing in." Mrs. Nelia's lips tightened, but she didn't reply. The crowd, however, was completely focused. A man by the dairy, Tom, who had been looking at his phone, put it down. An older couple, the Wilsons, whispered to each other but didn't take their eyes off the scene. "My grandfather," Shaq went on, his voice getting stronger, "fought in Germany for a country that sent him to war but wouldn't give him equal rights when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains, but he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed quieter now. "And my parents," he went on, his tone softening but losing none of its intensity. "They fought too, not with guns or fists, but by being who they are, raising me to respect everyone, no matter what they look like. My mother's a teacher. She spent her whole life teaching kids about love and equality. My father, he's a community leader, the kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down." He let the words settle before continuing, his eyes still locked on hers. "So you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, his voice now carrying a hint of sadness. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears." Miss Nelia's face flushed, her hands trembling a bit as she held her apples. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but stopped, her words catching in her throat. Shaq took a step back, his composure unshaken. "I could have walked away," he said, now speaking to everyone. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those." The weight of his words lingered, but the story wasn't over yet. The crowd's reaction would speak louder than anything else. The silence after Shaq's words was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Mrs. Nelia's face showed a mix of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, something that looked almost like shame. She looked around the crowd as if looking for support, but none came. A middle-aged man with a baseball cap, Donald, stepped forward. "He's right," Donald said, his voice breaking the quiet. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle, Mrs. Garcia, nodded. "My dad fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs began to grow. A young cashier no older than 20 named Anna called out from her station. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully, thank you." Mrs. Nelia, now visibly flustered, held her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean," but she stopped herself. Shaq turned back to her. His expression was softer now. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." A man from the deli counter, James, clapped slowly, breaking the tension. It was hesitant at first, but then others joined in. The sound grew into something undeniable. People clapped not just for Shaq's words, but for the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. Mrs. Nelia looked around once more. Her face was pale as she quietly pushed her cart towards the exit. As she left, a few people stepped up to comfort Shaq. One woman, Tanya, put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Shaq gave a small smile, lifting his basket back into his hand. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd started to leave, the tension replaced by a sense of thoughtfulness. Some people looked inspired, others were thinking hard. But everyone seemed changed a little. The moment had passed, but the impact of Shaq's words was far from over. What happened next would leave a lasting impression. As everyone went back to their normal activities, the mood in the grocery store felt different. It was quieter, more thoughtful. Shaq finished his shopping, his steps slow as he thought about what had just happened. The weight of the moment didn't shake him, but it made him reflective. At the checkout, the young cashier Anna, who had spoken up earlier, scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there?" She hesitated, then continued. "It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Shaq smiled back, his tone warm. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through anger," he responded. "It just builds walls." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot of Compton. As Shaq walked to his car, he noticed Mrs. Nelia sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he thought about going over to her, but decided not to. Some lessons take time to sink in, and he had already said what was needed. Later that evening, Shaq sat with some friends at his home in Compton, telling them about the day's events. They listened closely, nodding in agreement. "You did the right thing, Shaq," one of his friends, Leroy, said finally. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, they might not change right away, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes, plant the seed and let it grow." Shaq nodded, his friend's words striking a chord. He realized that while the encounter was tough, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence just lets it grow worse. Across town in West Compton, Mrs. Nelia sat at her dining table, staring at her untouched plate. Shaq's words echoed in her mind, challenging her beliefs. She thought of her grandchildren, the world they were growing up in, and for the first time, she felt something new. Doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at the grocery store in Compton spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Shaq's response, his bravery, and how he handled the situation with dignity. It became more than just an event. It became a lesson, a reminder of how powerful words can be and how important it is to stand up for what's right. Shaq didn't look for attention for what he did, but his actions spread through the community in ways he never thought they would. Strangers came up to him, thanking him and sharing their own stories of facing prejudice and showing strength. His quiet stand got people talking about things they'd been avoiding. Mrs. Nelia, too, started to change. It wasn't quick, but she began to doubt the beliefs she'd held for a long time. She didn't know if she'd see Shaq again, but if she did, she hoped she'd find the courage to say sorry. Moments like this show us the strength of kindness, courage, and honesty when faced with ignorance. They teach us that standing up isn't always about being loud. It can mean speaking calmly but firmly, letting the truth speak for itself. To everyone watching, let this be a reminder. Your words and actions matter. They can harm or they can heal. They can separate or they can bring people together. If this story touched you, let it encourage you to be better, to stand up, and to speak out for justice and understanding. Disclaimer: all stories shared on this channel are entirely made up and for entertainment only. We support a world where everyone has equal rights under the law and where society keeps getting fairer, more developed, and more civilized. Our goal is to share stories that warm hearts and make life better. Any similarity to real events, people, or organizations is just by chance and not on purpose. These stories don't aim to refer to any real people, events, or groups and have no political or religious messages.